Well, if you are visiting us this morning, then it will be helpful to know that we are on a journey through the big Bible story. And we've got to the part of the Bible where we're looking at what difference does it make for the people of Israel, God's people, the fact that God reigns. And I'd like to just ask that question to you now. It's a rhetorical question, so I won't put anybody on the spot. But what would it look like for you in your life if God truly reigned in your life? What would it look like for our community if God truly reigned here? If he was king of all that happens here, what would it look like? Because those are the questions that we're wanting to explore in this latest chapter in the big Bible story. And already we've begun to answer that question of what God's reign will look like when George spoke to us a couple of weeks ago about unity. A sign of God's reign will be a sense of unity. Not that we will necessarily agree all of the time, but the way that we choose to disagree will still display that sense of unity of heart and purpose. And as I've already mentioned, Jill last week reminded us of the importance of thankfulness, of having hearts that are thankful hearts. It's a sign of God's reign among us. And today, in this reading about the Ten Commandments, we're going to be looking at how God's reign is made real through the obedience of God's people. That's the people Israel, but also through the church. How can obedience be a sign of God's reign among us? Now, I'm not sure how you feel about this, but I have a sneaky suspicion that in today's culture, we might have a challenge on our hands to make obedience fashionable. What do you reckon? I have a sneaky feeling that some might associate obedience with some kind of blind submission to authority. And if you've had problems with any kind of authority, then that will just make it even harder to see obedience as something that you want to grasp hold of this morning. Well, I hope that by the end of this next hour and a half, you will have a different view of how obedience can mediate the love of God and how we can experience love through obedience. Now, to give you a little opener, I want to give you a story from the vicarage. Who's been to the vicarage? If you haven't been, come. We've got another Connections coming up soon. We are animal lovers, as you probably know, and we have Monty the dog. And I think Monty is, by and large, the picture of obedience. He absolutely loves to comply. He is a people pleaser. He loves to be where we are. If he gets lost from us on a walk, he desperately wants to find his way back to us. He is a picture of obedience in all bar the food department, probably. By contrast, we have a cat by the name of DJ Custard. Now, I want to just go on the record, I did not give him that name. But DJ Custard has a very different attitude. Like most cats, he's independent and proud of it. He will come to you, but if he does, it's going to be on his terms. And if he's not entirely satisfied with your lap, he will find somewhere else to snuggle up. And what's more, he is highly contemptuous of Monty. You should see the look in his eye, thinking, what a dumb creature you are. But let me ask you a question. What is the fruit of that fiercely independent nature? Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's looking at Monty and seeing that Monty is lavished with love and affection, of which there is plenty in our house for the animals, and hopefully each other. And he misses out. And friends, my guess is that we recognise that in the world, we live in a world where people are highly independent. We operate so much as independent beings. And you know, the reality of that, the fruit of that is often people are starved of love and affection and affirmation, to the point that the only place people can realistically find affirmation on a daily basis is by posting more and more stuff on their social media and looking at how many likes they get. And we are designed to be loved, to be affirmed. And the strange thing is that we find that love and affirmation through a life of obedience. Listen to what Jesus says to his disciples, his parting words to them He said, if you love me, keep my commands. Love and obedience in the Bible go hand in hand. Jesus says the greatest commandment is this, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. He summarizes the law that Sheila read for us. And when we are obedient to that, we enter into a cycle of love, created by God because he took the initiative, which is the whole point of this sermon series that we're going through throughout the year, that God takes the initiative and he moves towards us. He demonstrates his love for us. He rescues his people and he calls them into a life of obedience. And I want to look at that through this passage in Deuteronomy. But to help, I want to recap firstly on where we've got to in the story so far. Israel have been rescued in dramatic circumstances out of slavery in Egypt. And they find themselves in the desert, both free, but also dependent on God for everything, for food, for water, even dependent on God for guidance and direction in the pillar of fire by night, and the cloud by day. It's in this dual context of dependence and freedom on the eve of stepping into the promised land that God gives his people a set of commandments to follow. A set of commandments, he says, that if obeyed will provide a blessing not only for them, but for the generations that come. Now, we've just seen Caleb, we've got some of his family here. There are 3 generations of that family. We want blessing for the family that is coming after us, don't we? And God says it's in our obedience that we discover that blessing. And God seals that in a particular way. He gives to Moses not 1, but 2 copies of those commandments. Now, the practice of many ancient cultures in that day, as today is true as well, is that if you enter into a serious agreement, you each have a copy of that agreement. Who's moved home in recent months or years? Yes, 1 or 2 of you. The butchers were sweating on this on Wednesday and Thursday as their van was packed, waiting to move, but they couldn't do so until those 2 contracts had been exchanged. That was the moment of no return. If you're in employment, you will have a contract of employment. It will outline the relationship that you have with your employer and they with you. If you are married, you will have a marriage agreement, a contract. You will have a copy and the registrar will have a copy. And these things do 2 things in particular. These agreements, these covenants, these contracts. Firstly, they remind us of our obligations and our commitments. And they also show us that this agreement is a relationship that matters and that's important. We went to Tesco's yesterday to get our groceries, probably like some of you, and we weren't asked to enter into any kind of contract. It's not a serious a contract, not a serious arrangement. But where it is, it needs to be sealed in this way. So what are the specifics of this contract between God and his people? Well, of course, that could take an entire sermon series, couldn't it? 10 commandments, each with 20, 30 minutes each. Would you like me to summarise them for you instead? Good. Margaret's saying, yeah, get on with it. Come on. These 10 commandments fall into 2 distinct categories. The first 4 are concerned with a vertical relationship. They're concerned with our relationship with God. We're called to love God and to have no other idols before him. He is first and foremost, and the rest of those first 4 are all orientated that way. They're about that relationship, the up relationship that we talk about quite regularly here at St. John's. The up, the in, and the out. The other 6 commandments all relate to how we relate to people around us. They are concerned with the horizontal relationship. And here's the rub. If you want to get those relationships right, then the priority is that we get that relationship right. That relationship determines all of the other relationships that we can have in life. Now, you might say to me, well, Giles, let's just take one of these at random. Let's take number 6, thou shalt not murder. Surely that doesn't require a dependence upon God in order to truly keep that commandment, does it? Surely it's simply a matter of morals and ethics. Let me ask you this. Where do those morals come from? You see, in the absence of God, murder surely is just an evolutionary inevitability, isn't it? Isn't it? You see, the reality is that murder is wrong because life has value. It has value because it's given to us by God. It's precious. You and I are precious, which is why we need love and affirmation, because our lives are fragile and precious, and God wants to preserve them. And unless we get that vertical relationship with God first, then we struggle to understand the others. In Matthew 5, Jesus tells us that murder is a crime of the heart. He says, if you are angry with your brother, then you are literally murdering him in your heart and in your mind. I wonder if I can ask you just to call to mind this week. Has there been someone for whom you have felt aggrieved, you have felt angry and cross, and you are struggling to forgive them? Friends, unless you and I are obedient to that relationship, to love God and to put Him first, we will not see others as God sees them. Now, sure, some of our lives are masked with dysfunction and habits and wounds from the past. They affect who we are today. It's true, isn't it? For whom is that not true? Each one of us? But you know, when God sees you, He sees something different. We'll come back to that in a minute. You see, unless I am dependent upon God and recognize my need for forgiveness, unless I recognize God's image, the image of God in you and you and you and you, I will struggle. And God's rule and His reign in my life will not be complete. And it will mar God's rule and His reign in this place too. And it's true for thankfulness as well. Unless I'm dependent on God for my joy, I'll be tempted to cover what other people have. I won't be satisfied with my lot. I will be looking over my shoulder at what other people have. Thankfulness will dissipate. And I want to be a thankful person. So I need to look to God and to thank Him for all that He has done for me. Unless I get that relationship right, my relationships with others will struggle. And friends, so many of our lives, both inside the church and outside the church, are caught in these cycles of dysfunction. We see it played out on the world stage on much bigger scale than in our own lives, but it's true and it's there. The question is, how do we break out of those cycles? How do we do that? Well, it's not so much what we can do, it's what God has already done for us. In the letter to Romans, Paul reminds us that it was while we were still far off that God came and met us in His Son. The mission of God reminds us that the initiative is always God's. He takes the initiative. He moves towards us, just as He did with the prodigal son. He moves towards those who are lost. He seeks and searches us out. And God shows us what a life of total obedience is like in His Son, Jesus. Jesus' heart and His actions were perfectly aligned with His Father. I and the Father are one, He said. I only do the things that I see the Father doing. And Jesus' life was a beautiful life. It attracted people then and it attracts people now, which is why if you haven't done Alpha, you must do Alpha and find out more about Jesus. Can I encourage you? He is the most beautiful life and the most beautiful person, and he transforms people's lives today. Because what he did was an act of total, unbridled obedience to the will of God in offering himself. And Paul writes to the Philippians and says, he became obedient, even obedient to death on a cross. Jesus gave himself for us. He paid the price for us. And through his death, he's not only fulfilled the requirement of the law, but he showed us how to break out of those destructive cycles that we can find ourselves in. When we trust in him, when we trust in the work that he's done on the cross for us. You see, it's not a matter of trying harder. It's a matter of entering into that cycle of God's grace and love for us. Bringing our lives to God, saying sorry to him, recognizing our need for his love and his forgiveness. I want to finish with a so what. So what? What difference does this all make? What are the implications for our obedience on the world around us? Well, throughout this series, we've seen how God intends that his people Israel and now his church should be a light to the nations. You are a light to the nations. I don't know whether you realised that when you came in, but hopefully you realise it now you're going out. You are a light to Meads. You're a light to your neighbours. You're a light to those that you work with, that you come across. You are the one that they will read and they will see Jesus in you. It is our desire, isn't it, to reach out and to touch people with the love of God. Lots of ways that we do that. Alpha, Linking Lives, Coffee Pot, Open the Book, many others. These are all expressions of our desire to be obedient and to reach out. But I was challenged this week. I read a book that reminded me of where success is measured in God's kingdom. I think it's good to measure things, don't you? It gives us a sense of the progress that we make in life. Throughout my working career, I've worked on the basis that we try and measure the improvements that we want to see. And so I'm interested when we can find ways of measuring whether God's rule and God's reign is working here. Because if it's not working here, we can pack up and go home, can't we? Yeah? This is the measure that this offered. Success cannot simply be measured by the size of our church, the number of meetings we can persuade people to attend, the church programs that we run. Success in God's eyes can be reflected only by our obedience. It is our obedience that is a sign of God's blessing among us. And friends, as a community of faith, we are called to a life of obedience. Our lives should be open books to be read by others. And if God's reign is in this place, if God's reign is in our lives, then other people will see that through the signs of his reign. A unity. Unity despite the things that we may disagree with. Thankfulness, but also obedient hearts. And so, it matters, friends. It matters what you do from here and what I do from here. It matters how you and I relate to others. How we choose to deal with those unresolved conflicts in our lives matters. Because as you choose to respond to the Spirit of God who is prompting you to deal with those unresolved conflicts in your life, not only does God's rule and reign show more and more in your life, actually it shows more and more in the community that you're part of too. And people see it. You are the message. Let me finish with the wonderful words of an incredible disciple by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Many of you will have read some of his writings. He puts this far more succinctly than anyone could. He says, one act of obedience is better than 100 sermons.